Gavel strikes, echoing like gunshots. Judge Ronald Blackwood smiled as he threw a teenager's life away. He thought he was untouchable, handing down a ruthless, maximum sentence to a remarkably calm black teenager. He didn't know the boy's next phone call would completely obliterate his corrupt career and his freedom. Dust motes danced in the heavy, sterile air of courtroom 4B, suspended in the afternoon light that filtered through the high, barred windows of the Cook County Courthouse. Judge Ronald Blackwood sat perched on his elevated bench, a vulture in black silk, looking down at the stage he had controlled with an iron fist for over a decade. He was a man built on arrogance, with silver hair meticulously slicked back and a perpetual sneer etched into the lines around his mouth. Blackwood was currently running for a seat on the state Supreme Court, and his entire campaign hinged on a ruthless, tough on-crime platform. To him, the defendants who stood before him were not human beings. They were statistics. They were stepping stones. Seated at the defense table was 18-year-old Caleb Sterling, dressed in a sharply tailored navy blue suit that fit perfectly across his broad shoulders. Caleb did not look like the typical defendant Blackwood was used to breaking. He didn't fidget. He didn't look down at his hands. Instead, Caleb sat with an unnerving stillness, his dark, intelligent eyes tracking every movement in the room. He was charged with felony evasion, resisting arrest, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics. A heavy, terrifying list of charges stemming from a traffic stop 3 months prior. Caleb had been a passenger in a rideshare vehicle when police pulled it over. A duffel bag belonging to the driver was found in the trunk, stuffed with illicit substances. Despite Caleb having no connection to the driver, his out-of-state ID and his refusal to be intimidated during the interrogation had enraged the local precinct. They pinned the conspiracy charge on him, confident that the local justice system would chew him up and spit him out. "Your Honor," defense attorney Selena Jenkins began, her voice echoing with a mixture of passion and tightly coiled frustration. She was a brilliant public defender, exhausted but relentless. The defense moves to suppress the dashcam footage introduced by the prosecution. As we have clearly demonstrated, the footage has been selectively edited. There is a continuous 4-minute gap exactly during the time Officer Miller claims my client became physically combative. We have an independent forensic analyst ready to testify that the file metadata was tampered with. Prosecutor Bradley Whitman, a smug, 30-something attorney who had built his career riding Blackwood's coattails, slowly stood up. He didn't even bother buttoning his suit jacket. "Objection, Your Honor. Miss." Jenkins is throwing wild accusations at decorated officers of the law. The IT department already submitted an affidavit stating the camera experienced a routine battery failure. Judge Blackwood didn't even look at the files in front of him. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers, and fixed Selena with a look of utter disdain. Sustained. "Miss Jenkins, I am losing my patience with your theatrical conspiracy theories. This is a court of law, not a Hollywood movie. You will refrain from accusing our law enforcement officers of perjury unless you have concrete proof, which you clearly do not." "But, Your Honor, the missing footage is the proof of spoliation," Selena protested, her cheeks flushing. "My client was forcefully dragged from the vehicle without cause." "One more word out of turn. Counselor, and I will hold you in contempt," Blackwood snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "The evidence stands. The jury will disregard the defense's baseless claims of tampering." Caleb placed a gentle hand on Selena's forearm. He didn't look angry. He looked almost analytical, watching the judge as if studying a rat in a maze. "Let it go, Selena," he whispered softly. "He's playing exactly to type. Let him." Selena looked at him, bewildered. For 3 months, Caleb had been the most unusual client she had ever represented. He had insisted on proceeding to a jury trial despite the prosecutor offering a tempting plea deal of 3 years probation. He had refused to let her contact his family to post his bail, insisting he wanted to see exactly how the county jail and the court operated from the inside. She had assumed he was in shock, or perhaps foolishly naive, but there was a quiet, unshakable authority in his demeanor that constantly threw her off balance. As the trial dragged on through the afternoon, the courtroom transformed into a textbook kangaroo court. Blackwood systematically dismantled the defense. He sustained every one of Whitman's objections, no matter how flimsy, and overruled Selina at every turn. When Selina tried to cross-examine Officer Miller about his previous disciplinary record for racial profiling and falsifying evidence, Blackwood shut it down immediately, citing irrelevance. Through it all, Blackwood made sure to project his voice, performing for the stenographer and the handful of local reporters sitting in the gallery. He made disparaging, thinly veiled comments about Caleb's background. We see this all the time, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Blackwood pontificated during a ruling on a motion. Young men from out of state, coming into our community, thinking our laws don't apply to them, thinking they can bring their poison into our neighborhoods. "Objection! Prejudicial!" Selina shouted, standing up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the wood floor. "Overruled," Blackwood fired back instantly. "Sit down, Miss Jenkins." By the time closing arguments concluded, the atmosphere in the room was suffocating. Whitman painted Caleb as a hardened, arrogant criminal mastermind who used ride shares to mule drugs across state lines. Selina delivered a desperate, impassioned plea for common sense, pointing out the complete lack of physical evidence, fingerprints, or financial records tying Caleb to the duffel bag. It didn't matter. The jury instructions provided by Judge Blackwood were so heavily biased, effectively lowering the burden of proof for conspiracy to a mere suggestion, that the outcome was inevitable. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning to the box. "Have you reached a verdict?" Blackwood asked, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, handing a slip of paper to the bailiff. "On the charge of felony evasion, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of resisting arrest, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to distribute narcotics, guilty." Selina Jenkins slumped in her chair, burying her face in her hands. She had failed. Another young life was about to be fed into the meat grinder of the prison system. But when she looked to her right, Caleb was merely nodding slowly, as if confirming a long-held hypothesis. He didn't shed a tear. He didn't gasp. He just looked directly at Judge Blackwood. Given the severity of these convictions, Blackwood announced loudly, basking in the glow of his victory, "And my packed docket. I see no reason to delay. We will proceed to sentencing immediately." "Your Honor, I strongly object," Selina cried out, jumping to her feet. "The defense has a legal right to request a presenting investigation report. We have character witnesses to call. My client has no prior criminal record whatsoever. Expediting the sentencing is a gross violation of standard procedure. Standard procedure is at the discretion of the bench, Miss Jenkins," Blackwood retorted, slamming his gavel once. "Your client was caught red-handed bringing poison into my city. I do not need a probation officer to tell me what kind of character he possesses. The jury has spoken, and I have heard enough," the gallery murmured. Even Whitman, the arrogant prosecutor, shifted slightly in his seat, surprised by the sheer speed at which Blackwood was rushing to lock the kid away. But Whitman wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. Another major conviction on his record was a win. "Mr. Sterling," Blackwood said, leaning over the bench, his voice dripping with condescension, "stand up." Caleb stood. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate, calm precision. He met the judge's furious, hateful gaze with cool indifference. "You look at me with that arrogant stare," Blackwood sneered. "You think you're smarter than everyone else in this room. I know your type. You come in here in a nice suit, trying to pretend you aren't exactly what the jury found you to be, a menace to society. A thug." The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded with unspoken prejudice. "You thought you could come into my jurisdiction and play the system. But the system works. Justice works." Caleb finally spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. "Justice hasn't been present in this courtroom for a very long time, Ronald." The entire courtroom sucked in a collective breath. The omission of Your Honor was a glaring, deliberate act of disrespect. Blackwood's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "You dare speak to me that way? I am the law in this room, and the law dictates that a menace like you must be removed from society for the maximum possible duration. I am making an example out of you, Mr. Sterling." For the charges of evasion, resisting arrest, and felony drug conspiracy, I sentence you to consecutive terms totaling 65 years in a maximum security state penitentiary, without the possibility of parole." Selena Jenkins gasped out loud. 65 years. It was a de facto life sentence for an 18-year-old. It was absurdly draconian, a sentence usually reserved for murderers, not first-time offenders caught in a circumstantial drug bust. "Your Honor, this is an outrage. It's a blatant Eighth Amendment violation. Bailiff, restrain the defense attorney if she speaks again." Blackwood roared. He turned his venom back to Caleb, chest heaving. 65 years. You will die in a cage, Mr. Sterling. Remand him to custody immediately. Two heavy-set sheriff's deputies moved toward the defense table, handcuffs rattling. "Wait," Caleb said, his voice easily cutting through the tension in the room. He held up a hand. "By law, before I am transferred to a long-term holding facility to begin processing for a state sentence, I am entitled to one phone call to notify my family. I want my call now." Blackwood laughed a harsh, barking sound. "You want to call your mommy and cry? Fine. Let the record show that this court is magnanimous. Bailiff, give him your phone. Let him make his little call. Put it on speaker. Let his family hear exactly what happens to criminals in Cook County." Blackwood thought this was the perfect cherry on top of his performative cruelty. He wanted the gallery and the reporters to hear the weeping of a broken family. It would play fantastically for his Supreme Court campaign. The bailiff walked over, pulling a standard-issue smartphone from his duty belt. He dialed the speakerphone setting and handed it to Caleb. Caleb took the phone. He didn't hesitate. He dialed a 10-digit number from memory. The courtroom was dead silent, save for the rhythmic ring. 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 Echoing from the device. On the third ring, the line clicked open. "Arthur Sterling," a voice answered. It was a deep, gravelly baritone, authoritative and incredibly crisp. It sounded like a man who commanded armies. "Hey, Dad." "It's Caleb," the teenager said, his tone casual, as if he were calling to ask what was for dinner. "Caleb, I take it the proceedings have concluded?" the voice on the other end asked. "They have. You were right about everything, Dad." "Down to the letter," Caleb said, looking directly up at Judge Blackwood. They suppressed the dashcam footage. The judge didn't allow Selena to cross-examine the arresting officer about his IA files. "And he just gave me 65 years without parole." Expedited sentencing. He bypassed the presenting report entirely. A heavy sigh echoed through the speaker. "I see." "And the judge presiding?" "Ronald Blackwood," Caleb confirmed. Judge Blackwood sneered, leaning into his microphone. "That's right, Mr. Sterling. Judge Ronald Blackwood. And if you're thinking of filing an appeal on behalf of your criminal son, I'd save your money. He got a fair trial, and now he's going away for the rest of his natural life. You should have raised him better." There was a pause on the line. A cold, terrifying silence that seemed to drop the temperature in the courtroom by 10 degrees. "Judge Ronald Blackwood," the voice on the phone repeated, the tone now shifting from paternal to an icy, bureaucratic menace. "Let me assure you, my son was raised exceptionally well. He volunteered for this, against my better judgment, but he insisted on proving a point." Blackwood frowned, a flicker of confusion breaking through his arrogant facade. "Volunteered? What the hell are you talking about? Who do you think you are?" "I am Arthur Sterling," the voice boomed through the small speaker, carrying an undeniable weight that made Prosecutor Whitman suddenly sit up perfectly straight. "And I am the Attorney General of the United States." The color drained from Judge Blackwood's face in an instant, leaving him looking like a wax figure. The gavel slipped from his trembling hand, clattering loudly against the wooden bench. "Furthermore, Judge Blackwood," Arthur Sterling continued, his voice ringing like a death knell in the silent courtroom, "you are currently speaking on a recorded line monitored by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and as of 3 minutes ago, a federal warrant has been issued for your arrest." Total, suffocating silence blanketed courtroom 4B. The kind of silence that follows a bomb detonation right before the shockwave hits. Judge Ronald Blackwood stared at the smartphone in Caleb's hand, as if it had suddenly transformed into a venomous snake. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The smug, patrician mask he had worn for decades was cracking, revealing the terrified, small man underneath. At the defense table, Selena Jenkins sat perfectly still, her eyes darting between her teenage client and the judge. Her mind was racing, trying to process the absolute impossibility of what she was hearing. The Attorney General of the United States, Arthur Sterling? She knew the name, of course. Everyone in the legal field knew Arthur Sterling. He was a ruthless prosecutor before his appointment, a man famous for dismantling organized crime syndicates and corrupt political machines on the East Coast. And Caleb, her quiet, stoic 18-year-old client, who refused bail and insisted on facing a rigged trial, was his son. Is this some kind of sick joke? Prosecutor Bradley Whitman finally stammered, his voice an octave higher than usual. He stood up, pointing a trembling finger at Caleb. "Your Honor, this is a stunt! A clear violation of courtroom decorum. I demand he be held in contempt." "Shut up, Bradley," Blackwood hissed, his voice entirely devoid of its usual booming authority. He gripped the edges of his mahogany bench, his knuckles turning white. He leaned closer to his microphone, trying to project a confidence he no longer possessed. "Listen here, whoever you are. Impersonating a federal official is a felony. If this is a prank, I will see to it that you are prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law." Ronald Blackwood, the deep, resonant voice of Arthur Sterling, echoed from the phone, completely unbothered by the judge's hollow threats. "You were appointed to the bench 12 years ago. In that time, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has received over 400 complaints regarding your sentencing disparities, your blatant disregard for the rules of evidence, and your disturbingly close relationship with the local police union and private detention contractors." Blackwood's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. He looked frantically at the court stenographer, who had frozen, her hands hovering over her machine. "Stop typing!" Blackwood barked at her. "Off the record. Take this all off the record." "Keep typing, Nancy," Caleb said softly, his voice carrying clearly across the room. He didn't look at the judge. He was looking at the bailiff, who had slowly backed away from him. "It's all going to be needed for the federal grand jury." You set me up," Blackwood breathed, the reality of the situation finally piercing through his armor of denial. This whole trial, the traffic stop, it was a targeted, authorized, undercover operation. "Judge," Arthur Sterling continued over the speaker, "the Department of Justice has been building a RICO case against you, Prosecutor Whitman, and a dozen officers in your district for the past 2 years. But you were insulated. You never put anything in writing. We needed a catalyst. We needed a defendant who was entirely innocent, out of state, and possessed the exact demographic profile you so frequently target for your expedited, maximum sentence show trials." Selena gasped, turning to Caleb. You volunteered to be the bait?" Caleb finally looked at her, his expression softening into genuine apology. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you, Selena. If you had known, your reactions wouldn't have been genuine. Blackwood and Whitman would have smelled a rat. We needed a defense attorney who would fight like hell, only to be shut down illegally on the record. You did your job brilliantly. But the drugs in the car? The missing dashcam footage?" Selena asked, her legal mind rapidly connecting the dots. "The driver was an undercover FBI agent," Caleb explained, slipping his hands into his pockets, looking entirely out of place in his role as a convicted felon facing 65 years. "The duffel bag contained prop narcotics. The traffic stop was real, initiated by Officer Miller, who has a documented history of planting evidence. When I refused to consent to a search and asserted my rights, he escalated. The dashcam battery failure was Officer Miller manually turning off his camera to rough me up. What Miller didn't know," the Attorney General's voice chimed in, "was that my son was wearing a federally authorized covert biometric recording device. We have high-definition audio and video of Officer Miller striking my son, planting the bag, and coordinating the false arrest with his sergeant. Furthermore, "We have wiretaps confirming Prosecutor Whitman instructed the IT department to destroy the original dashcam file." Whitman's knees buckled. He collapsed back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. The arrogant, slick lawyer who had just spent an hour painting Caleb as a hardened criminal was now hyperventilating, his career and freedom evaporating before his eyes. "This is entrapment," Blackwood screamed, his composure completely shattering. Spittle flew from his lips. "You orchestrated a crime to frame a sitting judge. It's unconstitutional. Entrapment requires us to compel you to commit a crime you were not already predisposed to commit," Arthur Sterling replied coldly. "We didn't compel you to deny a fair trial. We didn't compel you to sustain bogus objections, deny a presentencing report, or hand down a 65-year sentence to a teenager out of pure, unadulterated malice. You did that all on your own, Ronald. We just gave you the rope, and you tied the noose." Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. The rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots against the hardwood floor drowned out the shocked gasps of the gallery. A dozen men and women in dark suits and FBI windbreakers flooded into courtroom 4B. They moved with absolute, terrifying precision, fanning out to secure all exits. Leading the pack was Special Agent in Charge Thomas Harrison. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped gray beard and eyes like chipped flint. He didn't look at the gallery, and he didn't look at the defense table. His gaze was locked entirely on the man sitting elevated behind the mahogany bench. "Judge Ronald Blackwood," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the immense weight of federal authority. He held up a thick manila folder. "I have in my hand a warrant for your arrest, signed by a federal magistrate judge just 20 minutes ago." Blackwood stood up, practically climbing over his bench. "You can't do this! I am the presiding judge in this courtroom. I have judicial immunity. Bailiffs, arrest these men! Clear my courtroom!" The local sheriff's deputies, who had been ready to haul Caleb away just moments before, stood frozen. They looked at Blackwood, then at the heavily armed federal agents surrounding them. Slowly, they stepped back, raising their hands away from their duty belts, wanting absolutely no part of this crossfire. Judicial immunity does not cover actions taken outside of your legal jurisdiction, nor does it cover taking bribes from the Gulf Coast Corrections Corporation to ensure their privately run prison beds remain at maximum capacity, Agent Harrison stated calmly as he marched straight up the steps to the judge's bench. Blackwood stumbled backward, knocking over his leather chair. The mention of the private prison contractor was the final nail. The secret, he thought, was buried behind shell companies, and offshore accounts was out. "You are being charged under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act," Harrison continued, reading from the warrant as two agents flanked the judge. "Along with conspiracy to violate civil rights, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence." "Don't touch me! Do you know who my friends are? Do you know who I play golf with?" Blackwood shrieked as an agent forcefully grabbed his wrists, twisting them behind his back. The unmistakable, sharp click of handcuffs echoed through the silent room. It was the exact sound Caleb had heard dozens of times during his 3 months in holding. Now, it was music to his ears. Down on the floor, Prosecutor Bradley Whitman was frantically trying to shove files into his briefcase. "Agent Harrison," Whitman babbled, sweat pouring down his forehead. "I can cooperate. I was just following his orders. Blackwood forced me to expedite these cases. I can give you everything, emails, text messages, the names of the officers involved." Harrison didn't even look down at him. "Save it for your lawyer, Mr. Whitman. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit perjury and destruction of evidence." 2 more agents hoisted the sobbing prosecutor out of his chair, slapping cuffs on his wrists. The reporters in the gallery, whom Blackwood had explicitly invited to cover his tough-on-crime sentencing, were now having a field day. Cell phone cameras were out, recording the magnificent downfall of Cook County's most feared judge. Blackwood, stripped of his robe, his silver hair disheveled, looked small, pathetic, and utterly broken as he was paraded past the jury box. As the agents frog-marched Blackwood toward the center aisle, Agent Harrison stopped them right next to the defense table. Harrison looked at Caleb. "You good, kid?" "I'm fine, Agent Harrison. Caleb replied, finally picking up his phone from the table. Dad, we're wrapping up here. I expect you on the first flight back to D.C. tonight, Caleb. Arthur Sterling's voice came through. Your mother is terrified, and I want you home. Excellent work. The line clicked dead. Blackwood, breathing heavily, glared at Caleb with a look of pure, venomous hatred. You ruined my life. You little punk. You destroyed everything I built. Caleb stepped out from behind the defense table. He was no longer the quiet, passive defendant. He stood at his full height, looking down at the disgraced judge. I didn't destroy anything, Ronald, Caleb said, his voice cold and steady. I just held up a mirror. You thought you could build a career on the backs of people who didn't have the money, the power, or the voice to fight back. You looked at me and saw a victim you could easily crush to get a few more votes for the Supreme Court. Caleb leaned in slightly, locking eyes with the man who had just sentenced him to die in a cage. Karma is a terrifying thing when it has the backing of the Department of Justice. Enjoy your 65 years. Agent Harrison nodded to his men. Get him out of here. As Blackwood was dragged out of the courtroom, kicking and screaming obscenities, Caleb turned back to Selena Jenkins. She was staring at him, wide-eyed, her briefcase clutched to her chest. Selena, Caleb said gently, extending his hand, I owe you an incredible debt of gratitude. You were fighting a rigged game, and you never gave up on me. The DOJ is going to be taking over all of Blackwood's past convictions. We're going to need aggressive, brilliant defense attorneys to help process the appeals and get innocent people out of prison. If you're interested, my father would love to formally offer you a job with the Civil Rights Division. Selena looked at the hand extended toward her, then at the empty, overturned chair where Judge Blackwood used to sit. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. I think, Selena said, shaking his hand firmly, I would absolutely love that. National news networks descended upon Cook County like a swarm of locusts the following morning. The arrest of a sitting judge and a senior prosecutor mid-trial by the FBI was an unprecedented spectacle, and the media tore into the story with ferocious appetite. Within 48 hours, the full scope of the Department of Justice's investigation into Judge Ronald Blackwood was leaked to the press, and the revelations were nothing short of stomach-churning. Blackwood was not merely a biased, cruel jurist. He was the linchpin of a highly organized, localized criminal enterprise. Forensic accountants from the FBI spent weeks tracing a labyrinthine network of offshore accounts and domestic shell companies. They discovered that for every maximum sentence Blackwood handed down to a young, minority defendant, substantial consulting fees were quietly deposited into a trust controlled by his brother-in-law. The money originated from a subsidiary of the Gulf Coast Corrections Corporation, the very entity that held the state contracts for private, high-security detention centers. Blackwood had been literally selling human lives to keep prison beds full and profit margins soaring. In Washington, D.C., Selena Jenkins walked into the imposing, marble-floored headquarters of the Department of Justice. True to his word, Attorney General Arthur Sterling had fast-tracked her clearance and appointed her as a special counsel within the Civil Rights Division. Her mandate was clear, heavily funded, and deeply personal: dismantle Ronald Blackwood's legacy. Working alongside Caleb, who was finishing his pre-law undergraduate degree while interning for the division, Selena spearheaded a massive task force reviewing over a decade of Blackwood's convictions. The work was grueling and emotionally taxing. They sat in windowless rooms surrounded by towering cardboard boxes of trial transcripts, discovering hundreds of cases identical to Caleb's fabricated sting. They found suppressed evidence, coerced plea deals brokered by prosecutor Bradley Whitman, and a sickening pattern of racial profiling by officers like Miller, who were all rapidly indicted. Slowly but surely, the rusted gears of justice began to turn backward. Over the next 18 months, Selena's team successfully petitioned for the immediate release and exoneration of over 200 wrongfully convicted individuals. Each release was a victory, but the ultimate reckoning still loomed on the horizon. 2 years after the explosive sting operation in Courtroom 4B, Ronald Blackwood finally faced his own trial. The setting was the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse in downtown Chicago. The federal courtroom was a stark contrast to Blackwood's old fiefdom. It was austere, intensely quiet, and completely impervious to local political influence. Presiding over the case was Federal District Judge William Rockford, a notoriously strict, by-the-book jurist with a reputation for despising judicial corruption. Sitting at the defense table, Ronald Blackwood was a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant tyrant he had once been. The stress of federal indictment, combined with the immediate freezing of all his financial assets under the RICO statute, had aged him 20 years. His once immaculate silver hair was thin and wispy. Stripped of his custom-tailored suits, he wore a drab, ill-fitting gray suit provided by his overworked public defender. His wealthy country club friends had abandoned him the moment the FBI raided his home. His wife had filed for divorce and fled to Europe. The trial was a slaughter. The prosecution, led by a ruthless assistant U.S. attorney named Catherine Pierce, methodically dismantled Blackwood's life. The star witness for the federal government was none other than Bradley Whitman. The former prosecutor had flipped within an hour of his arrest, signing a plea deal that required him to testify against his former mentor in exchange for a reduced 10-year sentence in a minimum security camp. Whitman took the stand and sang like a canary. He detailed exactly how Blackwood manipulated jury instructions, ordered prosecutors to hide exculpatory evidence, and maintained a secret ledger of convictions tied to private prison kickbacks. "He told me that these kids were just raw materials," Whitman testified, his voice trembling as he refused to look Blackwood in the eye. "He said the justice system was a business, and our courtroom was the most productive factory in the state. If I wanted to make partner, or eventually take his seat when he moved to the Supreme Court, I had to keep the assembly line moving." Following Whitman, the prosecution played the wiretaps. The jury listened in horrified silence to high-definition recordings of Blackwood laughing over drinks at a steakhouse, boasting about how easily he could throw away a street thug's life without a shred of hard evidence. When the verdict was read, it took the federal jury less than 3 hours to find Ronald Blackwood guilty on all 42 counts of racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and obstruction of justice. Blackwood didn't react. He just stared blankly ahead, his hands trembling violently on the wooden table. 2 weeks later, the sentencing phase commenced. The gallery was packed. Sitting in the second row, side by side, were Selena Jenkins and Caleb Sterling. Caleb wore a sharp navy suit, looking just as composed as he had the day he was falsely sentenced. Blackwood was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and a bright orange federal inmate jumpsuit. The visual was striking. The predator had officially become the prey. Judge Rockford adjusted his reading glasses and looked down from his elevated bench, fixing Blackwood with a stare of absolute disgust. "Ronald Blackwood," Judge Rockford began, his voice echoing through the silent chamber. "In my 30 years on the federal bench, I have presided over cases involving cartel bosses, domestic terrorists, and serial killers. Yet, sitting before me today is perhaps the most dangerous man I have ever had the misfortune of sentencing." Blackwood squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear leaking out and tracking down his wrinkled cheek. "You were entrusted with the most sacred duty in our republic, the impartial administration of justice," Rockford continued, his tone turning to pure ice. "Instead, you turned your courtroom into an auction block. You stole decades of life from young men and women who lacked the power to defend themselves against your malice. You fractured families and destroyed communities, all to pad your bank accounts and inflate your own monstrous ego." Judge Rockford picked up his gavel. "Your defense counsel has asked for leniency, citing your age and prior service to the community. But your service was a lie, and your age will not shield you from the consequences of your absolute moral rot. The federal sentencing guidelines suggest a minimum of 30 years. However, given the egregious nature of your civil rights violations, I am departing upward." Selena held her breath. Caleb leaned forward slightly. "Ronald Blackwood, I sentence you to serve 65 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons," Rockford declared, slamming the gavel down with a deafening crack. This sentence will be served consecutively, without the possibility of parole. Furthermore, I am recommending you be housed at the United States Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado. You will spend the rest of your natural life in a cage. Court is adjourned. Hard karma had finally come full circle. The exact sentence Blackwood had smugly handed out to an innocent 18-year-old was now his own inescapable reality. As the federal marshals grabbed Blackwood by the arms to drag him away, the disgraced judge looked desperately toward the gallery. His eyes locked onto Caleb. There was no arrogance left, only pure, suffocating terror. Caleb didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply gave Blackwood a slow, acknowledging nod, a silent confirmation that the ledger was finally balanced. Selina turned to Caleb as the courtroom began to clear, a profound sense of closure washing over her. We did it. We actually did it. No, Selina, Caleb replied softly, looking at the empty bench where the tyrant once ruled. We just cleared the rot. Now we go back to Washington and we start building something better. True justice is rarely swift, but when it arrives, it strikes with the precision of a guillotine. Ronald Blackwood thought his gavel made him a god. Instead, it forged his own heavy chains. Caleb Sterling and Selina Jenkins tore down a tyrant, proving that corruption's greatest enemy is quiet, unyielding courage. In the end, the broken system didn't protect the corrupt judge, it swallowed him whole.